And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the unceded and traditional territory of the Tsimshian people. Sweden is often seen as a forerunner when it comes to sustainability. For example, it has the highest share of renewable energy in the EU and is known for its thorough recycling and waste separation. On today's Open Connection, we open our archives to bring you this story from 1991.
BC's forests, beautiful, bountiful, and we once thought infinite. Well, we all know now they're not so infinite. Anyone who's flown over northwestern BC can hardly fail to notice the vast stretches of clear-cut areas. To some, it's shocking and disturbing. Many people, including native leaders, environmentalists, and others, feel the forest companies are decimating the land and permanently altering the environment by systematically denuding the forest lands. The companies, on the other hand, insist that while they've made mistakes in the past, they've learned from them and are managing the forest properly. They're also quick to point out the dire economic consequences we'd face if they were forced to cease operations, or if forestry became unprofitable because of overly strict regulations. Enter Dr. J.P. Kimmins, better known as Hamish Kimmins, professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia. His book on the subject is considered required reading by many forestry experts.
And he's perhaps one of the best known internationally in his field. So we're very fortunate, I think, to get somebody with this kind of reputation, this understanding of this subject, to come up into the Northwest.
Dr. Kimmins was the guest speaker at 4 public forums here in the Northwest, in Smithers, Houston, Hazleton, and Terrace, where he addressed the subject of clear-cut logging and forestry in general. He says, as often happens, many called for a blanket ban on clear-cutting. Kimmins doesn't go along with this type of thinking, saying the issue is much more complicated than 1- or 2-word sentences can handle. Kimmins also took the opportunity to tour the surrounding timberlands during his visit. I went along as he joined representatives of Skeena Sawmills and Skeena Cellulose and the Forest Ministry on a tour of Copper River area east of Terrace. And again, he stressed the importance of understanding the forests. Take this dead tree or snag, for example. The tree may be dead, but life abounds within it.
There's insects eating it, there's birds living in it and eating those insects, so there's a whole life associated with a snag, and society used to not worry about that. Many of those organisms may not necessarily be an absolutely vital part of that ecosystem, in the sense that if they're not there, the ecosystem won't work. The ecosystem may work very nicely without it, but we have made the judgment that we are poorer for losing that species, and we want to have it there. It may well be that some of those species do play an important role that we don't yet fully understand. So on average, we hedge our bet and say, let's try to keep them. But a few years ago, we didn't even ask that question, but now we have to think about it. So snags, yeah, they do play a role, and there's an important role with respect to streams. A log like that falling into a stream helps to create fish habitat and diversity in the stream, and there's a real concern that as we manage our forests and don't have trees dying and falling in streams, in the future, our streams will not be so good for fish. Even though we don't damage the stream, the mere fact those logs are no longer falling in will mean an impoverishment of that stream habitat.
As for setting aside huge tracts of land as reserves, as many advocate, Kimmins says that's not always the best solution.
Although, as a hobby, I like to ocean kayak and wilderness backpack, for my money in conservation, I would rather see a lot of small and medium reserves like that, so that every valley has one, representing the range of ecosystems, than that we set aside vast areas and not have the choices to have this mosaic of more local areas. That doesn't mean to say I don't agree with setting aside a few large areas, but in general, I would put the network of ecological reserves for conservation purposes, for network throughout the whole province, as a very, very high priority.
How much value is that to animals that have a wide range?
Well, things like grizzly bears, very little. But you are retaining examples of the old growth condition in terms of interest. You wouldn't want them to have them like 1 hectare. You'd want them to have reasonable sized patches. For some old growth dependent or old growth related species, as long as you created it big enough, they would have some benefits. But for widely ranging animals, no. But my understanding is that in many cases the greatest threat to animals like grizzly bears is access and the hunting pressure on them. That in fact many of these animals are quite happy. They get their habitat requirements in a managed area that's being harvested. So the harvesting itself is not a major impact on these animals, but the access that the harvesting brings may be.
Does that include wolves and animals such as that?
It may well be. There are cases with the woodland caribou in east of Williams Lake that is suffering a radical decline because of the import of wolves, and apparently the wolves were brought by the moose, but also there's things like skiduas going up, recreationists going up into the high country, creating a path along which wolves can walk and access that high country, whereas they couldn't walk on the soft snow. So sometimes access, recreationists or access roads, is one way in which you can get this spread of predators and then an upset in the balance.
He also says the shape and orienting of the clear cut is sometimes more important than its size, and that a long, narrow ribbon generally doesn't disturb a forest the way a square cut does. Kimmins also notes that while logging practices can definitely have an adverse effect on soil stability, sometimes it's the logging road that causes the real problems.
Often that's a function of roads and road building, so sometimes you can overcome that by using different harvesting equipment that requires less road or different road building techniques. But if you have slope instability on steep problems, you shouldn't have large clear cuts. If there's a great instability problem, perhaps you shouldn't log.
There still is a wide public perception that the forest industry is not managing the forest properly, and that the ministry isn't doing an adequate job of policing the industry. Why is that?
The public is not confident because of the perceptions that they have. In other words, they listen to the people who come out with some pretty bold statements. And they say, well, geez, I feel like I want to believe the bad news. Where's the good news? Is there any good news? And like Dan says, we're not very vocal about that. We've got to do a much better job of communicating what our harvesting levels are, what they're based upon, how we came about them. I think if you're to take that whole business about clear cutting, if it's carrying some baggage, it's the sustainability aspect. Most people do not believe that the current rate of harvesting can be sustained.
Professor Kimmins says it's vitally important, when so much of BC's economy depends on the forest, that we fully understand the consequences of whatever policy we adopt.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. Avalanche season starts in November, with the risks extending into May into British Columbia. The busiest months for avalanche risk are December through March. Let us return to the archives to bring you this story from 1991.
A little less than 2 weeks ago, one of Canada's worst skiing disasters happened near Golden. 4 people were killed when an avalanche engulfed them on a heli skiing expedition. It's certainly not the first life-threatening avalanche to hit BC. In 1974, the North Route slide path avalanched. It crushed a small cafe along Highway 16, killing 6 people. In 1989, there was the Goat Slide. It hit the highway, but luckily, there were no fatalities. It's situations like these that the Transportation and Highways avalanche technicians work so hard to prevent. It's their job to monitor the snowpacks in the mountains and watch for anything that might indicate the snow is going to break away.
You need terrain that's capable of producing avalanches, and you need some sort of trigger, something to make it release.
An avalanche trigger can be just about anything. A sudden change in temperature, a heavy snowfall, even excessive wind and rain. Each technician has their own area to cover and gather data for a snow analysis from. Part of their information comes from remote weather stations, situated on the tops of mountains. Every now and again, it's necessary to drop in and make sure they haven't seized up from the cold weather. There are also maintenance crews at road level, which feed the avalanche technicians information they gather from driving the highway and from what they can see of the mountain itself from down below. But the best way to gather the data is to go up onto the mountain and do a snow profile.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 350, roughly, you say? 1.
After picking a site which is representative of the snow path you're interested in, the first thing to do is see how deep the snow is.
7. Each one of these sections is 50 centimeters. So right now, we've got 7 sections, and the snowpack depth here right now is 350 centimeters.
To get a full record of what's happening in the snowpack, the technicians dig out a section to ground level.
The reason we're going to do this is to see if we can identify if there are weak layers in the snowpack, monitor the state of change in the snow. When snow falls, it's not in a static state. It's continually changing from the moment it turns into a snowflake to the time it turns to water and runs off the mountain in the spring. It's in a constant state of change. So we want to monitor the state of the change or metamorphism of the full snowpack and of various layers that might be in there.
The first thing to do is locate the various layers of snow and measure how far they are from the ground. Then the hardness or resistance is tested. It falls into one of 5 categories: fist, 4 fingers, 1 finger, pencil-shaped object, or knife-shaped object, depending on what can be pushed through the snowpack.
The first layer is going to be pencil resistance.
Then the consistency of the snow is checked. That determines how much water the pack is retaining. Through a magnifying glass, the actual crystals can be examined. At each level, snow temperatures are taken and snow samples are weighed. With a shovel, weaknesses in shear strength are checked. It's an easy way to see how well the layers are bonded together and if it would take much force for them to break away. All of these factors play a very important part in the potential for an avalanche. Even the variance of moisture levels in the snow can determine what type of avalanche will occur.
A dry snow avalanche has the ability, tends to move much faster, and in fact have been clocked speeds up to 240 kilometers an hour. They tend to travel in straight lines and not be confined by topography such as gullies or small valleys. They will seek the most direct route down the mountain. Moist snow or wet snow avalanches tend to be much more viscous. They move typically much slower and have mostly a flowing component, a flowing and to a certain extent turbulent component above the main mass.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. The decision to conduct explosive control is based on a complex analysis of current and future weather and snowpack conditions and the effect these conditions may have on avalanche hazards. Let us return to the archives with Al Evanchek.
Sometimes the best thing for the avalanche technicians to do is actually start the slide themselves with explosives.
We will do that on occasions where we can fly safely and do the job, and where an instability exists, and where either we feel that instability has the potential to affect the road, we want to get rid of it, and then open up the traffic, or we may do it in some cases where we feel that there's an instability there that if we don't release it now while it's a small avalanche, that in some circumstances it may not increase in strength. It may stay there, more snow build up, and then when we do have avalanches, they'll be much larger, much more destructive, take much longer to clean up.
The Highways and Transportation Ministry depends on the avalanche technicians to maintain safe driving conditions and minimize interruptions to traffic, not only for everyday travelers, but for maintenance crews as well. But with nearly 1,200 kilometers of provincial roads prone to avalanches, they can't be everywhere all of the time. The techs want to remind drivers that they can't stop all avalanches, but they can supply some degree of safety.
The main thing we feel that we supply is not the ability to control avalanches, but more the ability to control the hazard, the risk to people. Without running a safety program, we have the choice of either running the highways and accepting a very high risk of damage to property and loss of life, or the other option would be to have the highway closed for extended periods of time during conditions that we know are prone to avalanches, weather patterns. And that, I think particularly in this area, economically would be unacceptable.
The field work is not the only part of doing a snow profile. Once back in the office, the information has to be compiled. All of the characteristics observed about the snow are charted and compared to previous profiles. Any big changes in snow resistance, water retention, temperature, and shear strength can then be noted. The office work is just as much a part of the avalanche technician's job as the field work is. Since they can't be out on the mountains every day, they spend a lot of their time collecting and sending out weather information.
Pretty much every morning, the routine is to start off gathering data to build an analysis of the snowpack and what sort of chance of avalanche hazard we have to the highway each day. That starts off with collecting weather forecasts. We have an assortment of weather products we'll collect, from fairly detailed to general synoptic, and also a long-range forecast.
From the office, the technicians can even retrieve information from the remote weather stations on the mountaintops. And every hour, the road crews phone in their reports. The radio room can connect all of transportation and highways personnel across the province.
Region 5. Yes, stand by.
In fact, you can be up on a mountaintop and you can, by phone patch, talk to people in Victoria if it's necessary, which at times has been vitally important. It's quite an amazing system.
What's amazing is all the detail and accuracy that goes into this relatively new field of study. As of yet, man does not possess a complete and thorough knowledge of what controls avalanches, but they do possess a knowledge of how to ensure safety in the meantime. Majestic as they are, towering above the landscape, mountains and their snow-topped coverings can be an instrument of death.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Born in 1977 at the Baltimore Zoo, Bart the bear grew to over 9.5 feet and weighed 1,600 pounds. In this final segment of Open Connection, producer-director Bud McLaren shares his experience working with Bart.
Filmmakers from across the world have used BC to produce their works. But it's not often the film's writer, producer, director, and talent hails from this province. An exception is being made evident this month across the north as Attack of the Grizzly is on the big screen. Bud McLean is indeed the writer, producer, director, and star of the flick, which was made in McLean's own backyard, the Chilcotin. It was a monstrous undertaking, and McLean wasn't certain he was up to the challenge until he received a little special encouragement.
I took it to Vancouver, to the National Film Board, and they were absolutely fantastic. I've had no government help, not a penny. I've had no help from anybody. But they encouraged me. They read my script, and they said, you have the most important part. You have the beginning, you have the middle, and an end. If you can film it that way, you'll have a successful film. So I talked to film producers, and the money was, like you say, astronomical. And so I just circumvented it in the way I've always did. If someone says you can't do it, you find a way you can do it, and I did it. And we did all the shooting in 18 days. Total of 14 really, but actually it was 18 days.
That was the push McLean needed to go on. But it was his own beliefs that prompted him in the first place. McLean has made the Chilcotin home most of his life, and when he found out news about the grizzly, he took action.
They estimated there were 48 grizzly bears left in the Chilcotin. That's a huge, huge country. And when I heard there were 48 bears, I thought there were hundreds. So I said, shut it down, close it. And eventually, myself, I can't speak for guide outfitters, but I know a lot agree with me in the Chilcotin. There will come a day, not too many years from now, when the majority of our guide business is going to be taking people with cameras. That's going to be worth far more than taking a guy out there and shooting that animal.
Yes, the bear. If McLean is the star of the show, don't think Bart doesn't deserve equal billing. This 1,600-pound grizzly is no stranger to the big screen. He was cast quite appropriately as the star of the movie The Bear not so long ago. Now, admiration among actors and actresses is not uncommon, and so it is with McLean and his cohort in Attack of the Grizzly.
In my film, a man shoots the bear. In my motion picture, toward the end, this bear jumps out on a trail and my horse bucks me off. I get hit on the head with a rock and the bear comes and stands over me. In the beginning of the film, I find a grizzly bear cub 1 year old in a wire snare and I release it from the snare. And 6 years later in the film, this little cub is Bart. And he has this ring here from where the hair grew in the wound. And he backs me up against a tree. And it's something because when you're looking at him, you're looking right like that at him. And he goes to knock my head off, and then I talk to him like he was a cub, and he lets me go. But another part of the movie, and then when he lets me go, a man shoots him in the shoulder in the film, mistakenly, thinking he's going to hurt me. And from then on, the bear walks with one paw up like that. It's absolutely incredible. It's really something to see.
So far, in places like Williams Lake, Quesnel, Smithers, Vanderhoof, and Burns Lake, the movie has attracted good crowds. All ages have attended a flick that McLean says reflects the needs of moviegoers in British Columbia.
I didn't want to make a cutesy motion picture. I didn't want to make a cutesy film where the skies are cloudy all day and the deer and the antelope play. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to make a film that shows British Columbia the way it is in the 90s. And I think people expect that now. I think people are becoming too cynical. Every film isn't all cutesy. This film is, I mean, I'm biased because it's my film, but it's great. It's an interesting film. It shows British Columbia as it is, and the bear is the star, and they're roaming around here too, all over the country. And what happens in this film can happen any place. It's the same thing. The animals and the man family are both seeking the same thing.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.